Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. I was in Chicago yesterday, and my travel plans were somewhat tenuous for a little while. You know, we always get those little text messages from UT saying it's raining, but then I started getting ones from my children's school saying, "Don't worry, the boys are in the hallway and everybody's okay." And that began to get my attention and was somewhat distracting, as text messages can be. And then this morning over breakfast, my 3-year-old is explaining to me that a tornado is wind that takes little boys and whooshes them away from mommy and daddy. So if there's anybody here from child life and psychology, I may need some help with that one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cord blood banking. We love our children very much. That was certainly driven home for me again yesterday. And we do a lot for them. We buy very expensive things to nourish them, and we go to ridiculous extents to monitor them, even though they sort of have that built-in cry thing. And we protect them, right? We protect them from, high speeds, hot water, deep water, the wind and the elements. We protect them from gravity, and we even protect them from their own best friend. Sometimes they don't like what we do, but much of what we do is reasonable. We get carried away from time to time. This product up here is actually called the Thud Guard. And for those of you with hardwood floors, maybe you're lamenting not having had one. But it's a very logical extension then that over the course of the past 10 years, expectant parents all over are asking themselves, should I save my child's cord blood? And I think our job as practitioners is to answer this question correctly, or at least in an educated manner. So this is the overview of what I'll talk about today, a little bit about hematopoietic stem cell transplantation, what it means to have a match. I'll talk about the role of cord blood in transplantation and really work hard to differentiate between public and private cord blood banking. And I'll talk about some of the information and misinformation that's given to expectant parents, and then I'll talk for a little bit about cord blood-derived stem cells that are currently being used in regenerative medicine. Simple slide. Anybody who has ever been treated by me has seen this because I can't talk and draw at the same time, so this is the first thing I share with patients. But bone marrow is the source of all of the bloods that circulate, or all of the cells that circulate in your blood. The red blood cells which carry oxygen, the white blood cells which fight infection, the platelets which help your blood clot. And hematopoietic cell transplantation is replacement of the patient's bone marrow with multipotent progenitor cells. And through the process of division and differentiation, they become all of the cells that circulate in your blood. And we may stop here. There we go. So there's a couple of different rationale for hematopoietic cell transplantation. The first and by far the most common indication is to fight cancer. The actual transplant regimen isn't necessarily what's curative, but the ability to give back your own hematopoietic cells allows us to give super lethal doses of chemotherapy. And we sometimes do that to fight solid tumors. The other thing that we sometimes get is the donor cells, the transplanted cells, can actually directly attack the recipient's cancer cells, and that would be called a graft versus leukemia effect. We can also correct defects of bone marrow-derived cells, and these can be congenital defects such as immunodeficiencies, acquired defects like aplastic anemia. These are defects that can affect single lineages like sickle cell disease, or multiple lineages like dyskeratosis congenita or Fanconi anemia. We can even use transplant to correct certain metabolic abnormalities that are outside of the bone marrow, and these would be diseases like Hurler syndrome. Now, many transplantable diseases exist, and the list is growing. Sometimes the best therapy is transplant, and sometimes the only therapy is transplant. But what's going to be important to distinguish is that there are certain types of transplant, and only certain diseases can be cured by certain types of transplant, and I'll get into that. Bone marrow was the first bone marrow was the first source of hematopoietic stem cells. The first bone marrow transplant was in 1968 at the University of Minnesota, and what you see here is a liquid bone marrow harvest. So they put needles in the posterior iliac crest, and through multiple draws in the bilateral crest in the operating room, they take the liquid part of the marrow out and they collect the stem cells from that. There's a couple different types of stem cell transplant. The first is autologous transplant. That means you are your own donor. There's an allogeneic, sometimes, and what this is there's a gift of stem cells from one donor to the recipient. That can be a related family member or it can be a stranger. And then there's syngeneic, which an identical twin is the donor for another. An allogeneic transplant from one person to another requires a good stem cell match. Finding a match is very important for transplant. We've all seen these bone marrow drives, the Be the Match drives. Based on simple Mendelian genetics, the likelihood of you having the same HLA haplotype of your brother or sister is about 25%. And given that we all have 2.2 children within each family, 30% of patients within this country are going to have a matched SIB, which is nice, but that also means that 70% of patients are going to require a non-related donor for an allogeneic transplant. And this is tricky because many different combinations at each of these loci are possible. The MHC loci are some of the most genetically diverse coding loci in mammals. And for example, at the HLA locus, currently there's over 700 alleles possible. At the B locus, there's 1,000. At the C locus, 382. And so if you multiply all these different combinations together, there's about 1.4 times 10 to the 23 possible unique genotypes. I think that number is a jillion. So it's a lot. Fortunately, due to sort of complicated things like linkage disequilibrium, we are not so diverse, and it actually is possible to find a match, but it's still tricky sometimes. Matching is important. When we do a bone marrow transplant, the transplanted bone marrow contains some mature donor T cells. And in a mismatched transplant, every cell in the recipient's body has MHC molecules that the donor has never encountered. So these mature T cells that have been transplanted bind to the recipient MHC independent of the peptide in the groove, and that stimulates this with fairly high affinity. And the T cell actually attacks the cells, any cell that has an MHC molecule, which is most of the cells in the body. So the result is a massive immune attack against the recipient, and that's called graft versus host disease. I won't do too many pictures of this, but here you see grade 4 graft versus host disease of the skin, shredded intestines at autopsy. And graft versus host disease is bad. No graft host disease, this is a study in adults. Grade 1 or 2 graft host disease, grade 3, grade 4. Graft versus host disease in and of itself can kill you, but both graft versus host disease and the therapy for graft versus host disease are so immunosuppressive that they predispose patients to life-threatening infections. And so any HLA mismatch decreases survival. This was from ASH a couple years ago. And don't worry about what the survival numbers, but I want you to see is the difference. An 8 out of H match, in this study had a 52% survival, but just one allele mismatch dropped the survival by 10%, by another 10%. Each additional mismatch decreases the overall survival by 9 to 10%. So clearly, we don't have enough donors on the bone marrow registry such that everybody who needs a transplant can get a transplant. So we needed to look to other sources, not we, somebody who came before, but umbilical cord blood contains hematopoietic stem cells. And you can see the baby's been born, the cord has been cut, somebody's putting a needle in the umbilical cord, the blood is collected, it's stored in a bag, and then it's frozen at 196 degrees below 0 centigrade, which is the median temperature of Minnesota in February. So the advantages of cord blood, well, there's no risk to the donor. The baby's been born, the cord has been cut before the blood is even collected. It can be cryopreserved and stored more or less indefinitely. There's a mechanism by which we should be able to make very, very large inventories that are rapidly available. We should be able to increase the ethnic diversity of our donor pool by targeted donation. These cells are immature and have a very high proliferative potential. They're immunologically immature, so they have a lower incidence of graft versus host disease. And then they're new, so they have less EBV, less CMV, and the cell counts are known, so we know if the cord blood bag is big enough for the potential recipient. Cord blood transplantation is gaining ground. That's these bars in green, and here's time. Cord blood transplant accounted for about 20% of transplants in the United States and about 50% in Japan. Greater than 20,000 cord blood transplants have been performed to date. In the year 2006, there were about 2,000 cord blood transplants, and we can expect about 10,000 per year by the year 2015. And this is an international endeavor. In about 40% of cord blood transplants, the donor and the patient are living in different countries. I think that's kind of pretty incredible. So in 1998, there was the first umbilical cord blood transplant for Fanconi anemia. In 1993, the first public cord blood bank was established in New York. Paris, Milan, Dusseldorf, and Sydney all followed. And now there's 36 international public banks that serve greater than 500 transplant centers. Greater than 500,000 cord blood units are available to the public worldwide. In the United States, the National Marrow Donor Program has greater than 160,000 units, and then funding to provide better matches for various ethnic groups. And most centers offer directed cord blood banking from a patient's siblings. So if a 4-year-old has leukemia and mom is pregnant, they will save that cord for the 4-year-old with leukemia just in case, because there's about a 1 in 17 chance that they will actually need it. So clearly, private cord blood banking followed shortly thereafter. Private banks are for-profit cord blood banks, and they offer expectant parents what they call biologic insurance against future diseases for their newborn. They promote the benefits of possible autologous transplant for the child, allogeneic transplant for family members, and the future promise, of course, of stem cell therapy. Currently, greater than 150 private banks exist worldwide, and that's compared to the less than 40 public banks. Private banks hold your cord blood for you. There is no way to get it back into the public pool. Once it's stored in ViaCord, cord blood registry, cryobanks, whatever, it can't go out to the public. Okay? Private cord blood banks target expectant parents aggressively. I think anybody who's had a baby recently, and this is pediatrics, so all of us have experienced this. And they advertise this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and they use slogans, right? Storing your baby's umbilical cord blood could save their life. Don't let a precious resource go to waste. These are the things that they say. And here's an example of some of the advertising that they do. And you can read it as well as I can, but protect your family. Your baby's umbilical cord blood is rich in life-saving stem cells that could protect your baby or other family members. Treat nearly 70 diseases, including leukemia, other cancers, and blood disorders. Take advantage of your one chance. Birth is the only opportunity to save your baby's cord blood. Otherwise, it is thrown away. Current research has revealed positive results in the treatment of a wide variety of different medical conditions, including ischemic heart disease, cancer, spinal cord lesions, bone fractures, burn strokes, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and diabetes. We have even begun outsourcing stem cell therapy. This is the Mayfield Clinic for Regenerative Research, not the Mayo Clinic where I went to medical school, but the Mayfield Clinic. And they say that we can arrange for non-controversial cord blood-derived adult stem cell treatments for a variety of conditions, including cancer, MS, sickle cell, leukemia, spinal cord injury, Parkinson's, diabetes, and many more. Cord blood-derived adult stem cells are used exclusively by our clinic for ethical reasons, and because they can be highly effective to treat the same conditions as embryonic stem cells without ethical objection. Now, lest you accidentally travel to Rochester, Minnesota, they don't want you to do that. They, if you don't know where the Mayfield Clinic is, they have included a map. And it's on this little island right here, Montserrat, down in the Caribbean, which doesn't seem like a terrible place to vacation, at least. But while you are visiting the Mayfield Clinic for Regenerative Research, please check out the Soufriere Hills volcano. It's been dormant throughout recorded history, but in 1995 it buried the capital city of Plymouth under about 40 feet of mud and ash. Don't worry, the last mudfall was in 2006. But all joking aside, slogans, oh boy, let's get past that. Slogans work. And so, in a survey of 325 pregnant women who used private banks, here were some of their reasons for using them. Safeguard for the future, 83% said. A belief that public banks cannot always or usually find a suitable match. And the belief that cord blood has successfully treated Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and spinal cord injury. This is not true. And so, who are these idiots? Well, they're not. These are highly educated people. 94% had an undergraduate degree, and 58% had a postdoctorate degree. But they weren't able to sort out the truth from fiction. And here's reinforcement from a ViaCord mom. This is something I pulled off the web a couple of weeks ago. Susan says, we banked both of our children's cord blood too. Thankfully, we haven't needed it, but I feel this is the best insurance policy in the world. I can't imagine how I'd feel if I turned it down and didn't have this chance if my children needed it. I mean, today's mom doesn't have to wait for medical advice. You know, she's online, she's connected, and she's working through the mommy networks to get advice like this. I was reviewing this on kind of my midnight flight back to Dallas last night and sitting next to a pilot who, you know, had sort of said, you know, where are we with cord blood? And he got an earful. But, you know, he said, as a first-time parent, you know, I don't want to be the guy who was too cheap to protect their kid if they really needed it. And so it's out there. And so it sort of begs the question, are expectant parents vulnerable adults? Are they at risk of being exploited? And really, I don't mean they, I mean we. You know, is the way private banks target parents ethical? And what are our obligations as caregivers? And maybe the question you ask then is, well, why is it my job? Am I my patient's keeper? And I would actually say, yes, you are. Healthcare providers play a critical role serving as links between the donor and the recipient in any kind of tissue transplant, whether it's blood, cord blood, livers, or hearts. And that's the idea of the solidarity chain. And for-profit organizations need to be excluded from this because the ethical principle here is that biologic material is a common good and should not be used as a commodity to be bought and sold. Equal rights of access should be ensured for all in need. And when we commercialize this process, I think it really violates that ethical principle. And we're vulnerable, right? We can be influenced. It wasn't so long ago that obstetricians in this town would be taken by a private cord blood bank to Three Forks restaurant. Anybody eat there on a regular basis? No, not on my salary. But they would, you know, while they were eating and drinking wine, they would get a lecture on how they can collect cord blood for a private bank and how they could charge the insurance company $250 to $300. And on the way out the door, if that wasn't enough, they would get a check for $250. So while we try to protect our patients from, you know, using scientifically rigorous data, I think we're all vulnerable. So when I talk to families about this and when I talk to the providers, you know, this is the kind of questions that families should be asking. You know, when you're really trying to make an educated decision for yourself, these are the kind of questions that you can ask. And I'll go through all of these in the next slides. First of all, how can my child's cord blood protect my child in the future? Because your child's cord blood isn't going to protect your neighbor if you put it in a private bank. And what this really focuses on is not who needs a transplant and not who needs an autologous transplant, but who needs an autologous cord blood transplant. Okay, I had given a talk like this to some obstetricians in Tucson, Arizona a couple weeks ago, and they had this really cool system where you'd put up questions like this, and then they'd text in, and a graph would show up in real time. It was like American Idol. It was kind of neat. But they could answer this. So where's a chief resident? Let's pick on one. There's some. Natalie. Autologous umbilical cord blood transplant can successfully treat which of the following? You get one.
I would say D.
D? And that's fair, right? Because the first transplant went for, okay, but it's autologous, right? Fanconi disease is a bone marrow failure syndrome, and you don't put your own cord blood back into a bone. So, by the way, when you're going to guess, you know, guess aggressively, say E or D, because even if you're just guessing and you say it authoritatively, I'll think you got it right. But yeah, they didn't get it either. They also had Fanconi because I had baited them with a previous slide. So in terms of transplantable diseases, and these are just pulled off websites as advertised by cord blood banks. So there's cancer, immunodeficiencies, bone marrow failure syndromes, central nervous diseases, traumatic injury, blah, blah, blah. So we'll just kind of go through these. So central nervous system diseases, AML, Alzheimer's, Huntington, there are no data that you use autologous cord blood or stem cell therapy for this. This is all experimental. Same with traumatic injury. There's some animal studies in rats going on. In terms of autoimmune diseases, yeah, there are people thinking, well, what if we reset the immune system? But why would you put back the same immune system that caused the autoimmune disease in the first place? And that's the same for bone marrow failure syndromes. You know, why would you give back cord blood for sickle cell disease or Diamond-Blackfan? Or why would you treat an immunodeficiency with cells that all contain the same genetic mutation? And certainly we don't treat acute lymphoblastic leukemia with an autologous cord blood transplant because you don't want to have that seeding cancer cell within the bag. So there's a few diseases which can be treated with autologous transplant, right? And here's the list. Well, it turns out that for things like neuroblastoma or Hodgkin lymphoma, we only use autologous transplant for advanced disease or high-risk disease. For relapsed non-Hodgkin lymphoma or multiple myeloma, autologous or allogeneic transplant are indicated. And then for some of these solid tumors, autologous transplant are certainly used in the context of clinical trials. However, peripheral blood stem cells are absolutely the standard of care. We here will not use your child's autologous cord blood that's been banked through a private bank. And it's not because we're high and mighty, but when we do a peripheral blood stem cell collection, we need to know the cell counts. We need to have enough for 1 or 2 transplants in case the first one fails. And your cord blood might not be enough for you, and we don't know the quality of the collection. So the best indications for an autologous cord blood transplant is acquired aplastic anemia. This is an acquired immune-mediated bone marrow failure syndrome. It has an incidence of about 3 per million per year, so pretty uncommon. And to put it into perspective, the odds of being struck by lightning are about 576,000 to 1, so within the ballpark. I was recently at a national meeting, and I talked to a person named Charlotte Niemeyer. She's sort of an expert in aplastic anemia. And I said, you know, what are the data on this? What are the data on treating acquired aplastic anemia with autologous cord blood transplant? And she said, I wish somebody would publish it, but nobody really knows. She herself, a nationally recognized world's expert, has treated 3 patients, and 2 of them didn't do well. And so it may be that the immune system is still revved up even after the conditioning. So this is the best theoretical indication, and it's still not really mainstream. So what are the real data on cord blood transplants? So this is Eurocord report. So they tracked all the cord blood transplants from '88 to 2007. They looked at 3,300 of them at 300 transplant centers in 43 countries. And in terms of unrelated, so me to some stranger, 90%. Related, so this would be a sibling who has leukemia, receives a cord blood from a brother or sister who doesn't, almost 11%. And autologous, 3 out of 3,300, less than 0.1%. But you wouldn't know that from looking at the cord blood websites because they don't publish, they advertise. There's really only 3 published case reports from within this time frame. There's 1 infant with stage 4 neuroblastoma, a 3-year-old with CNS relapse of ALL, which we wouldn't do here, a 20-month-old with severe aplastic anemia, which is possibly the correct indication. But no commercial provider has ever published peer-reviewed data on the numbers of cord blood units stored, used, or the outcomes. And that's very different than our public banks like the Texas Cord Blood Bank or the National Marrow Donor Program. But instead, they're more than happy to advertise on their websites. So they'll say things like 15 years experience with 230,000 clients. No, they did not do 230,000 transplants. They just collected money from 230,000 people. One of them advertised, well, we've done 116 autologous transplants, and when I went through that list, 113 of them were for things like brain injury, cerebral palsy, diabetes, hydrocephalus, apraxia, PVL, and head injury. These are conditions for which transplant is not only not indicated, but I think to a great degree the theoretical rationale for doing them is somewhat questionable. So, well, what about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and the promise of stem cell therapy? If you look at this woman, it appears that she has been cured of her liver disease, her multiple... I mean, she's doing really well for having gone through all of that. I mean, and the internet makes it appear that stem cell therapy is available and effective. Can anybody guess what website this came from? You won't, because you're going to say Viacord or something like that, but it was a cosmetic dentistry website. Really? They've branched out. Okay, so anyway, stem cell therapy, right? So embryonic stem cells, the one that's made the news, these are pluripotent. They can differentiate into neural cells, cardiac muscle, and blood cells. But what we use for cord blood transplant or bone marrow transplant, we're using multipotent hematopoietic stem cells. These are a little bit more differentiated, and these don't differentiate into neurons or muscles. They differentiate into the cells that circulate in the bloodstream. So the idea of treating Parkinson's with cord blood, when you think about it this way, it's not really supported by clinical data, and the theoretic data are questionable. But since the first time I made this talk, I had to put an asterisk here because we'll get to that later on. And size matters. Cord blood units from private banks are below average. So this is the total nucleated cell count, and it comes in on a bell curve. And the red are the ones collected by public cord blood banks, and the blue are the ones collected in private banks. And here's your threshold for what you could actually use for a transplant. And essentially, the privately collected ones tend to have lower volumes, lower stem cell counts, lower total nucleated cell counts, and a higher incidence of bacterial infection. So not all cord blood banks are created equal. And so is it really the best insurance policy in the world, like this Viacord mom blogged? Well, no. I mean, an autologous transplant, for one, only allows you to give higher doses of chemotherapy. It's just a mechanism of rescue from lethal chemotherapy. And like I said, size matter. A cord blood transplant is going to require 2.5 times 10 to the 7 nucleated cells per kilogram of recipient body weight. Each cord blood unit has, a range of nucleated cells, and each patient obviously has a range. A 70-kilogram patient's going to need this many cells. And maybe the easier way of looking at it is the average patient outgrows the average cord by age 11. So imagine, is it really the best insurance policy in the world if it's there, it's ready for you, but only if you weigh less than 36 kilograms, and it only treats one disease? So maybe not the best. And it's not cheap. Here are some procurement costs from different commercial sites, and this is yanked from the web again, and then an annual fee for storage. And so data from 27 private banks across the United States showed an average procurement cost of about $1,450 and an average annual cost of $120 per year. But that's not just cost, there's also marginal cost, right? What else could you be doing with your money? So if you store it for 20 years, you pay $4,000, 70 years, $10,000, which isn't huge when you're thinking about like saving for college. But what if you invested it at 5%? Okay, which, and what if you invested it at 10%, which might be generous in this economy, but there are better things that we can do with our money, perhaps. And I would hope for that my parents put away this money not for a cord, but for this. We'll see. And is there also a cost to society? And I think this is far more important than kind of the personal financial cost. Another question I asked, in the United States, what % of cord blood is stored privately in cord blood banks? Is there another chief in here? Jackie, I see you.
I would say A.
Okay. No, it's actually exactly the opposite, right? In the United States, 90% of cord blood units are stored privately in commercial banks, and only about 10% are stored in public banks, okay? So 750,000 units are squirreled away where our patients who need an unrelated transplant can't get them. So who needs a stem cell donor? It's not hard to find people who are on a wait list. Certainly if you're lily-white, Western European descent like me, it's probably going to be easier to find a donor. But we're a global community now. So we have, a 39-year-old mother of 2, a Chinese businesswoman and triathlete, a Filipino boy from Tribeca, and this guy, but all waiting for transplants. And these are beautiful people, and some of them died while waiting for a transplant, and that's sad. Is there another one in here, or did David hide? All right, fine. So what is the chance that an African American will find a 6 out of 6 matched cord in a hypothetical cord blood bank containing 500,000 units donated exclusively by African Americans? And this is a hypothetical bank. There is no such bank. There are not 500,000 cord blood units donated exclusively by African Americans. But what's the likelihood of finding a 6 out of 6 match? Guess loud, anyone. Anyone else? C, yeah, we're working our way down the list. It's C, it's 60%. And that's not good enough. This is actually from the bone marrow registry as of the National Marrow Donor Database file back in 1997. So we're better than that. But this was the number of donors in the registry by ethnic group. And so the chance of finding a 4 out of 6 match is lovely, right? 99% of patients can get it, and that's why we say, oh, there's always a cord blood for you. But the chance of getting a 5 out of 6 match is still pretty good. It's kind of dropping off for Native Americans. But the chance of getting a 6 out of 6 match on the bone marrow registry is actually a lot less. And so that was a hypothetical, and then this is based on what we really have. And so, well, if a 4 out of 6 match is good enough, who cares? Well, it matters, and I'll show you why in a little bit. I already did, because mismatches are bad. And there are racial disparities in cord blood donation. So when you look at the cord blood pool that's currently available to the public, it's 62% white, 7% black, and 17% Hispanic. So this certainly highlights a racial disparity, but it also shows us an opportunity for intervention, because the birth rate for African Americans is 16%, and for Hispanics it's 23.3%. So we actually have an opportunity to help. And this disparity is not due to differences in core beliefs or values. Okay. A study was done looking at beliefs about cord blood donation among Hispanic and non-Hispanic black women, and most of the participants had actually not been aware of cord blood donation. However, once these focus groups had sort of had these big discussions, among the participants who had already given birth, women expressed hurt and regret at not being told by anyone on their healthcare team about the possibility of donation. And this is donation to a public bank, not squirreling it away for yourself. And participants felt that they should have been told of the opportunity. Okay? So I think that the responsibility for correcting this falls on us, on the caregivers, because we can. We're the only ones who can. And because we should. It's the right thing to do. We're getting there. 27 states in this country have cord blood education laws. Embarrassingly not Minnesota, where first cord blood transplant was done. And currently now there's greater than 400,000 umbilical cord blood samples stored in public registries worldwide. Most are in the United States, but they're growing throughout the world. And here's the number of cord blood units on the cord blood registry. That's our National Marrow Donor Program. So it's going up. We're getting better. But finally, what happens to children without banked cord blood? What happens if I donate it to a public bank, but then my kid eventually needs some sort of transplant? Well, here's the reality. Multiple sources of hematopoietic stem cells exist. We can get them from the marrow, we can get them from the cord blood, and like here, we can get them from the peripheral blood. We give the patients GCSF to stimulate the release of stem cells in the blood, and we plug him up to a machine for a few hours, and he's happy because he's watching TV, and we collect it by an apheresis machine. Okay? And this is the standard of care. Autologous transplants are usually done through peripheral blood stem cells, not cord blood. So there's also no therapeutic advantage over autologous cord blood. There's some theoretical advantage about why cord blood is good for transplant, but for autologous transplants, there's no proven advantage at all. And so when we talk about parental guilt, like the pilot I was talking to on the airplane, when people ask me, if I don't pay to save my child's cord blood, am I a bad parent? I say no. This is the moral equivalent of failing to install an airbag on your child's stroller. It would be excessive. But here's the reality check. I would argue it's expensive. There's a 99.9% chance or higher that you won't need it. 50% of the cords collected are not usable anyway. There's no therapeutic advantage over cord blood versus autologous peripheral blood. There's no current role in stem cell therapy. Anything is experimental at this point. And I would argue that because you're taking away a resource from somebody else, I think it's actually unethical. And when I was giving this talk to the obstetricians a week or so ago, I said, imagine that you have a patient on the table who has placenta previa, now they have an abrupted placenta, and they're bleeding to death before you, and there's no blood available for them because people like me, instead of donating our blood to Carter Blood Care, we donated our blood, but we said, I want it saved just for me in case I need it in the future. Okay? I think the parallel's fair. This is not just my opinion, although I'm very opinionated, but major medical organizations agree with me, and I can show you some of those statements if you want them. The exception is going to be related cord blood banking, and that's recommended when a sibling has a transplantable disease. So if you have a child who has ALL and you are pregnant, it's okay to save that next child's cord specifically for the older sibling. But you can also do that through a public cord blood bank, and it should be offered to you free, and it always is. And then I usually give people, okay, here's the Be the Match website, here's a place where you can get some more information about cord blood, and for a less medically savvy audience, I try to stop here. But there's more. In 1992, a health economist made a prediction, and it was this: a new branch of medicine will develop that attempts to change the course of chronic disease and in many instances will regenerate tired and failing organs. And this is regenerative medicine. Okay. Now, we all have some interesting mental images of what regenerative medicine should be. Looking at designer organs that we grow in a jar and give to people, kind of like spare parts for a car. Or we grab something off the pharmacy shelf and then we inject it into failing joints or failing brains or failing vision, and they somehow magically, migrate to the site of injury and fix it. With any kind of advanced technology, there's always an element of magic to it. We're not at this level yet. Oh, geez, there's that hyperlink thing. How do I learn to avoid that? So to really talk about regenerative medicine, a couple of terms sort of need to be understood. One is the term totipotent. This means that that cell can differentiate into every cell in the organism, and the only example of that is a zygote. There are pluripotent cells which can differentiate into all three germ cell layers, and there's a number of different examples of these, but one of them is the embryonic stem cell. There's multipotent, and these are cells that can differentiate into greater than one stem cell or one cell lineage, and that's like the hematopoietic stem cell. And then there's unipotent. These are stem cells that can differentiate into a single lineage, but they can still have some replicative ability, and this would be the cardiac stem cell. Okay. What are embryonic stem cells? Okay, well, an embryo is created in a laboratory. At 6 days, the blastocyst consists of a spherical layer of cells surrounding a cavity that's filled with fluid and stem cells. And then harvesting these stem cells to differentiate them into all these things destroys the blastocyst. I think we can all understand the ethical concerns regarding this process. But to call this polarizing is sort of the understatement of the year. Here's a political cartoon. Partial birth abortion? No. Stem cell research. And there's a line of dead babies at the pearly gates. Culture of Life Club, here's George Bush. Sorry, Billy, some life stages are more sacred than others. He's holding the baby in the test tube, and here's the boy in the wheelchair. Embryo's welcome. Billy is not. Back to the other side. If embryonic stem cell research kills me before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. And then here are the prayers, right? Let's pray for the sinners who engage in the devil's work of stem cell research. Lord, let them help find a cure for my dad's Alzheimer's, a cure for my mom's Parkinson's, or a cure for my cancer. This debate is so polarizing and so emotionally charged that I think a true intellectual discourse, at least within the media, is never going to happen, and there will be no compromise, not with embryonic stem cells. And so we're not going to talk about it. We're going to look at workarounds. So let's start with cord blood. So cord blood is a source of stem cells. I've already sort of ad nauseum talked about, multipotent hematopoietic stem cells are live. This is prime time. We can use them to cure people and help them fight their cancer, their metabolic diseases, their immunodeficiencies. Now, it's allogeneic. It's from one donor to the other. But this is active. We do this. Anytime you've ever done any research in a lab, no matter how distant and remote, you want to include it in a slide so people know you know how to hold a pipette. So this was part of my fellowship project where I made a xenogenic model of graft versus host disease. So we took human peripheral blood mononuclear cells and injected them into severely immunocompromised mice, and those human cells proliferated. Here's the CD4 cells, here's the CD8 cells. The mice lost weight, became horribly anemic. These are hematocrits in the 10 range. They died compared to the controls, and their organs showed a lot of inflammation with human CD4 cells and CD8 cells. So it's a model of graft versus host disease. And what we were able to show is that we could take umbilical cord blood, human umbilical cord blood, and isolate a population of CD4, CD25, FOXP3, umbilical cord blood derived regulatory T cells, expand them 600-fold in culture over the course of less than 3 weeks, and maintain a good degree of purity, And then when we injected them into these mice, concomitantly with the peripheral blood mononuclear cells, the ones that got no regulatory T cells got sick and died, and the other ones lived. The ones that got no regulatory T cells had target organ destruction and lymphocyte infiltration, and the ones that didn't. And so what the point of this is that besides hematopoietic stem cells, there's other cells within umbilical cord blood that need to be studied for research. Regulatory T cells are one of them. Another lab has said that cord blood contains multipotent stem cells. They were able to isolate from a monolayer basically what are called cord blood stem cells that through culture and growth factors can be differentiated into ectodermal originating cells like neuronal cells, oligodendrocytes, mesodermal cells like cardiomyocytes, blood cells, endothelial cells, and endodermal cells like insulin-producing cells. So cord blood has multipotent stem cells. But wait, there's more. The whole umbilical cord provides multiple sources of stem cells. The cord blood has hematopoietic stem cells, mesenchymal stem cells, cord blood, embryonic-like stem cells. Wharton's jelly of the cord itself contains mesenchymal stem cells, and it actually contains a lot. 1 centimeter can yield 1 billion mesenchymal stem cells in about 30 days, and then the average cord is about 50 centimeters long. So, that's 50 billion mesenchymal stem cells. So, this is a good resource. And then the umbilical vein contains human umbilical cord vein endothelial cells, which can also be differentiated. But cord blood isn't the only source. So in 1998, the first human embryonic stem cell line was made. In 2006, mouse skin cells were transformed into what are called induced pluripotent stem cells. So they added a few genes, and now they had these induced pluripotent stem cells that could be made into blood, gut, cardiac muscle, etc. In 2007, induced pluripotent stem cells could be generated from human skin, in 2009 from human cord blood. So maybe we don't need embryonic stem cells. Admittedly, they are a useful tool for science and research, but we may have to leave them alone and do something that's much more ethical. So cord blood can be an excellent source of induced pluripotent stem cells. It's the youngest source of stem cells. We already have a mechanism of tissue procurement that's organized and validated, and the HLA data are known. Xeno-free protocols allow for the generation of clinical-grade induced pluripotent stem cell lines that could potentially be used for both research as well as treatment. There's already a remuneration model through what the private banks have taught us, and this may actually stimulate the cord blood banking business. So the idea here is that we get the private banks to start collaborating with researchers to use this resource, towards kind of the common good rather than just serving as a mechanism for kind of the annual collection fees. So this is win-win-win, right? Industry wins, research wins, and hopefully downstream the patients win. There have been some preclinical animal studies using cord blood stem cells. So, and these are just a couple examples. There's a bunch. There's a model of stroke where they take IV umbilical cord blood mononuclear cells, not just the stem cells, but just everything. And they inject them into rats after transient middle cerebral artery occlusion, and that improved neurologic functions in the one who got it. Similarly, in a model of myocardial infarction, they took umbilical cord blood injections and injected them, in shortly after the infarct, and they reduced the infarct size, enhanced angiogenesis, and improved left ventricular ejection fraction. In some studies failed to show efficacy, but some did. And this is not a rat who had a myocardial infarct a long time ago. This is like within hours of the ischemic event. These beneficial results are not due to stem cells going to the source of injury and kind of dividing and differentiating and fixing it. It has more to do with sort of the properties of what they're actually putting in. So here's some of the mechanisms proposed for the rat model of stroke. And basically, what comes out of the human umbilical cord blood cells is they release neuroprotective factors. They have anti-inflammatory effects, and then they blunt the peripheral immune responses. So, yes, it's regenerative medicine, but it's not truly stem cell therapy yet. So I think it's fair to say that the future of cord blood is diverse. It includes autologous and allogenic transplantation, maybe using regulatory T cells to make this a safer and less barbaric process. It certainly involves the collection of stem cell fractions for differentiation and at least clinical trials in a number of different kinds of diseases. So yeah, cord blood stem cells will have a future in regenerative medicine. However, the future of regenerative medicine will not be limited to cord blood. So besides cord blood, bone marrow also contains pluripotent mesenchymal stem cells. These are easy to access, isolate, expand, and preserve. They are extremely immunosuppressive and poorly immunogenic, so there may not be a requirement for HLA matching between donor and recipient. They may have a role in the repair of damaged tissue, and currently there are greater than 80 clinical trials ongoing worldwide. There's also adult or somatic stem cells. So this would be take a cardiac stem cell out of the heart and put it back into the heart. They don't differentiate into other things, but maybe we don't need that. These have a sort of an in vivo role in just growth, healing, and replacing cells that are lost through daily wear and tear. Here's an example of a human clinical study from Lancet, where they took patients who had had myocardial infarction, and they all had decreased left ventricular ejection fractions before their coronary artery bypass graft, and they took these stem cells out and in a randomized way put them back, injected them through the coronary artery into the patients, and the patients who were in controls didn't see a major difference, but those who got these cardiac stem cells had a statistically significant improvement in ejection fraction, and this was seen at both 4 months and 12 months after therapy. So this isn't cord blood, this isn't bone marrow, these are just adult stem cells taken from adults and put right back in. So there's lots and lots of ongoing research, and we don't know what the future will hold. What really is the best source of stem cells? There's even people looking at endometrial regenerative cells, aka menstrual stem cells. There's kind of a yuck factor involved in this, but endometrial stem cells, they are multipotent or pluripotent. They differentiate into cardiomyocytes, neuronal cell lines, adipocytes, osteogenic cell lines. Preclinical testing has already been done in rats. It's reduced myocardial infarct size in a rat model of ischemic heart. They secrete neuroprotective factors in a rat stroke model. They improve dopamine production in a rat model of Parkinson. So, this really isn't a joke. There's even been phase 1 human trials in patients with multiple sclerosis. Now, these people didn't get up and walk again, and those data, aren't released. This is phase 1, so it's to see if they're safe, but they are safe. And so where there is research, there is always a commercial interest. This is Cell, which has offered us the opportunity to bank your own endometrial stem cells, and you can see at the bottom their little motto here is, "Welcome to Cell, where every month holds a miracle." So, in conclusion, umbilical cord blood is clearly an underutilized medical resource that currently has immediate, life-saving clinical applications. Immediate. Okay? Increased ethnic diversity of cord blood banked in public registries is absolutely needed, and we, the pediatricians, the neonatologists, the obstetricians, the nurse practitioners, it's our job to kind of help make people aware of this. Neonatal tissues, the cord blood, the cord, the endothelial cells, these are the largest, most genetically diverse stem cell source that can be accessed rapidly in a non-invasive, cost-effective manner. And so we really need to promote research in this. And there continues to remain the potential for commercial interest to compete with, and as we've seen, eclipse altruistic opportunities using this resource. So my recommendations haven't changed, even after putting the stem cell component in. Directed donation to a sibling with a disease that could be cured by transplant is indicated. It's free, and public banks will do this for you. Donate the cord blood to a public cord blood bank if you don't have, the first criteria. If you can't donate it to a public bank, donate the cord blood to biomedical research. And what we really know is that not all cord blood collections are created equal. You need to collect cord blood in different ways to isolate different populations of stem cells, and I think that's where we can get some benefit from research. And if you can't do those things, throw it away.